How much do you think the Democratic Party media alliance, I mean, I call it the incest of Ivy League, or the bubble of bias, the people who cover politics tend to be the same kind of people who are in politics. How much do you think that machine takes advantage of and exploits the culture of divorce? You lay out the statistics of the proportion of unmarried women that voted for Barack Obama, and it's stunning.
Right. Well, I mean, unmarried parenthood, single parenthood, and I grew up for part of my childhood in a single parent home, so I'm not casting moral aspersions.
Sure.
But it's not preferable, and it's difficult, and it exposes a much higher percentage of kids to economic instability. It makes you poorer, on average. Not for everyone, but on average it makes you poorer and more dependent and more vulnerable. And economically vulnerable people are far more dependent upon government services. It's a fact. And the Democratic Party understands this, and they've exploited it. And unfortunately, because single mothers are now a huge percentage of the Democratic electorate, Democrats, even responsible, thoughtful ones who know better, cannot say what is true in public, which is, all things being equal, you are much better off if you have married biological parents raising you. That's not a matter of speculation. There's a mountain of social science that proves it true. Common sense suggests it's also true. The experience of millennia suggests the same. And yet the Democratic Party is in an electoral position where they're required to deny it. And that's bad for the country. And again, this is not a matter of attacking single women with kids, needless to say, but it is a matter of telling the truth, which is if you have generations of young boys raised by single mothers, you have much higher levels of generational poverty and violence, and all the pathologies that we're so familiar with. A lot of those stem from family structure. Duh. And nobody can say that out loud because one party is dependent on them for votes. And it's a terrible cycle that we're in. And I wish someone on the left were brave enough to say it out loud, but they're not. They're cowards who care about power, period.
Well, that's come up as a sub-theme on my show constantly, this the crisis of masculinity and fatherhood and the departure of dads from families and so on. Let's turn to immigration just for a moment. Now, this is a trigger alert. If you're somehow of the snowflake brethren variety and you've been listening so far, buckle up, because I'm going to use a phrase that many find offensive. I'm doing it on purpose. Wetbacks, illegal aliens. That phrase was used repeatedly and defended in its use by none other than Cesar Chavez. Now, I didn't grow up here, but I've spent 20 years in Los Angeles, and folks like Reginald Cardinal Mahoney could not get through a homily or a speech without some mention of Cesar Chavez. He's ubiquitous. He's gang tag graffiti. He's on billboards. He's practically on peanut butter. But he was very concerned about the swamping of the border by illegal Mexican workers because it really destroyed what he was trying to build as a union leader.
Cesar Chavez was the co-founder of United Farm Workers, the fruit pickers, produce pickers, and he was obviously Hispanic and left-wing, very left-wing, and he believed, like almost all liberals did up until very recently, that tight labor markets served working people. In other words, the more employers had to compete for labor, the higher the wages were, the more average people benefited. That is true. It's an economic truth because supply and demand is a fact of physics. And so he believed that the growers, the businesses, the employers had an incentive to increase the amount of illegal immigration into the country so they could lower their labor costs. It's really simple. He was joined in this by every liberal of his age. He marched across the state of California in 1969, the year I was born, with Ralph Abernathy. The Reverend Ralph Abernathy was MLK's chief aide, and Walter Mondale, the senator from Minnesota, who later ran for president in 1980. Mainstream liberals agreed with him. In 1979, Cesar Chavez dispatched union members to the Sonoran Desert of the Mexico border with whips made of barbed wire and clubs to beat Mexican immigrants as they came across the border. Why? Because he hated Mexicans? Of course not. He was Mexican-American. No, but because he cared about the wages of his workers, his union members. This was the view. Almost all, in fact, I would say all that I'm aware of our anti-immigration, immigration restrictionist legislation from 1900 up until yesterday, all of them got there because of support from organized labor. And about 10 years ago, the Democratic Party decided it no longer cared about organized labor. that it was dying, that it was taking the side of employers over employees, the rich over the middle class, and they reframed the issue as a tribal one, as a matter of racial identity. And so if you are worried about slack labor markets and lower pay for your employees, you're a racist. It's insane. And the Republicans bought into it because they were, of course, traditionally on the side of employers. And so left undefended was the entire American middle class. And guess what? As illegal immigration levels rose, wages for American-born workers stagnated. Again, this is not speculation.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of academic research on this. If you have more people willing to work for less, wages decline. It's supply and demand. And yet the left ignores it.
And isn't that the meeting spot of the left and the right? The right wants cheap labor, and they're fine with open borders, and the left wants Democratic voter base increase. It's win-win. This is why
here are the numbers you need to understand. Yale University released a study last week by 3 researchers, all of them liberal, I believe, who concluded that the actual number of illegal aliens in this country is not 11 million, it's north of 22 million. 22 million. Fact 1. Fact 2. The Democratic Party is now, as a matter of policy, calling for the legalization of all illegals in this country. Citizenship voting rights. 22 million new voters. Fact 3. The overwhelming majority of first-time immigrant voters vote Democrat. Fact 4. The largest margin in American presidential history was 17 million votes. 1984 election between Mondale and Reagan.
And Reagan, yeah.
17 million. You would add to our voter rolls 22 million, at least, permanent electoral majority in perpetuity. That's what this is about. It's not about making the country better, serving our labor needs, helping the population. It's about putting Democrats in power forever.